There is a place in the Pacific Northwest where the forest does not end at the shoreline. It keeps going, down through the tide zones, past the barnacled rocks, beneath the surface of the cold green water, until at depths of 30 and 40 feet, the standing trunks of ancient trees rise from the seafloor like the pillars of a drowned cathedral. The branches are gone, the bark has long since dissolved, but the trunks remain rooted in mud that was once dry ground, pointing upward toward a light they will never reach again. These are not the remains of a recent storm or a localized flood. These trees died when the ocean rose, and the ocean rose because the ice melted, and the ice melted at the end of an age so remote that the civilization we call ancient, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, had not yet begun to dream itself into existence. The trees beneath the water are a calendar. They tell us that this coastline, which looks today as though it has always been exactly as it is, was once something completely different. A wider land, a lower shore, a place where people could have walked for miles before reaching the water. And if people were walking there, and evidence is beginning to suggest that they were, then everything we thought we understood about who first came to Canada, and when and from where, may need to be reconsidered from the very beginning. This is not a story about a single discovery. It is a story about accumulation, about the slow, patient gathering of evidence from mud cores and cave floors, and the extracted genetic material of people who died thousands of years before the concept of a nation, or a border, or even a name for this part of the world had entered any human mind. It is a story about the limits of what science thought it knew, and about the moment, repeated several times in recent decades, when a laboratory result came back and the researchers stared at their data and understood that they were looking at something that did not fit, something that had no match, something that belonged to a population that science had never documented and that no living person, as far as anyone could determine, had descended from. The remains were real. The DNA was real. The people who left those bones behind had lived and breathed and walked the land that is now called Canada. But where they came from and where they went and why they left no trace in the genetic record of any living population on Earth, these are questions that are still being asked, still being debated in laboratories and at academic conferences, and in the quiet hours after the data has been processed and the conclusions cannot be avoided. To understand what was found, you have to understand what was there before. Approximately 20,000 years ago, the landmass that we now call North America looked nothing like the continent shown in any atlas. The northern half of the continent was buried, not covered with snow in the way that Greenland is covered today, but buried, crushed beneath ice sheets of a thickness and mass that are genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of what is now Canada and extended deep into the United States, was in places more than 3 kilometers thick. 3 kilometers. The weight of that ice was so immense that the bedrock beneath it was compressed downward, pushed into the mantle of the earth like the surface of a mattress beneath a sleeper. Even today, thousands of years after the ice is gone, the land is still slowly rising, rebounding upward, centimeter by centimeter, decade by decade, in a process geologists call isostatic rebound. The ground in parts of Hudson Bay is still rising at a rate of more than a centimeter per year, still recovering from the weight of ice that melted more than 8,000 years ago. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the western mountains, the ranges that are now the Rockies and the Coast Mountains and the Cascades. It pressed down over British Columbia and into what is now the state of Washington, sealing the western coast beneath a frozen mass that moved as all glaciers move, with an imperceptible slowness that nonetheless accomplished enormous things. It carved the fjords, it ground the valleys, it polished the bedrock into the smooth, striated surfaces that hikers sometimes run their hands over today without understanding what made them. But here is the thing about ice sheets. They are not uniform. They are not one solid wall from horizon to horizon. They have edges and margins and zones of thinner coverage. They have places where the topography of the land beneath them forces them apart, creates corridors, allows for the possibility of passage. And along the coast of what is now British Columbia, along the outer edges of the islands that today form the Haida-Gwaii archipelago and the Alexander archipelago of southeastern Alaska, there is growing evidence that the glacial coverage was not complete, that certain areas, protected by their elevation or their position relative to ocean currents, remained ice-free even during the height of the last glacial maximum, that these areas were not barren rock, but productive refugia, places where plants grew and animals lived, and perhaps where human beings found shelter during the coldest centuries of the Ice Age. The idea that people were living on the northwest coast during the last glacial maximum is not new. Indigenous oral traditions in the region have always maintained that the connection to this land is ancient beyond reckoning. The Haida people of Haida Gwaii have stories about a time when the land was different, when what is now an archipelago of islands was a more connected landmass, when the shores were lower and the forests reached places that are now underwater. For generations, these stories were received by outside scholars with the polite skepticism that academic culture reserves for knowledge that does not come through its own approved channels. They were classified as myth, as metaphor, as culturally significant, but not literally true. Then the archaeologists started finding things. Triquet Island is a small piece of land off the central coast of British Columbia, accessible only by boat and isolated enough that it sees few visitors. It is not a dramatic landscape. It does not announce itself. But beneath its surface, in the compressed organic layers of an ancient midden, researchers from the University of Victoria found evidence of continuous human habitation, stretching back approximately 14,000 years. 14,000 years of people living in one place, cooking food, discarding shells, leaving behind the small material traces of daily life, beginning at a time when the last ice age was still grinding toward its end, when the glaciers were still massive and the sea level was still substantially lower than it is today, and the coastline of British Columbia looked nothing like it does now. 14,000 years. To put that in perspective, the pyramids of Egypt are approximately 4,500 years old. The oldest known writing system is perhaps 5,500 years old. The agricultural revolution, which most history curricula treat as the foundational event of human civilization, began somewhere between 10 and 12,000 years ago, and even then it was a gradual process that took millennia to spread. The people of Triquet Island were already living on the northwest coast, already part of a culture with its own traditions and technologies and relationship to the land before farming existed anywhere on Earth. The discovery at Triquet Island was significant, not just for what it found, but for what it confirmed. It confirmed that the coastal areas of British Columbia were habitable during the late Pleistocene. It confirmed that the ice-free refugia hypothesis was not merely theoretical, that people had actually been there, and it raised a question that became harder to ignore with each subsequent excavation. If people were living on this coast 14,000 years ago, who were they? Where had they come from? And were they the ancestors of anyone alive today? These questions led to the laboratories, and the laboratories led to discoveries that nobody had fully anticipated. The revolution in ancient DNA analysis began in the 1980s and accelerated dramatically in the 2000s with the development of next-generation sequencing technologies that made it possible to read genetic information from degraded biological samples, from the teeth and bones of individuals who had been dead for hundreds or thousands of years. The technique requires exceptional care. Ancient DNA is fragile. It breaks down over time into shorter and shorter fragments. It is contaminated easily by the DNA of the researchers handling the samples. But when the conditions are right, when the samples have been preserved by cold, or by aridity, or by the chemistry of certain soils, it is possible to reconstruct a genetic profile of a person who died millennia ago with a level of detail that allows for comparison against the full diversity of human genetic variation alive today and documented in the archaeological record. What this means in practical terms is that it is now possible to ask of a set of ancient remains, who did this person's descendants become? Which modern population carries this person's genetic legacy? To which branch of the human family tree did this individual belong? And in Canada, in multiple sites, the answer that came back was none. No known branch, no documented modern descendants, no match. The Paleo-Eskimos arrived in the Arctic regions of Canada approximately 4,500 years ago. They were not the ancestors of the modern Inuit. They were not closely related to the First Nations peoples of the subarctic and boreal regions. They were something separate, a distinct population that had crossed into North America from Siberia, followed the Arctic coastline east, and spread across a vast territory that stretched from Alaska through the Canadian Arctic to Greenland. For approximately 4,000 years, they were the people of the far north. They hunted seal and walrus and muskox. They built their tools from stone with a precision and refinement that archaeologists continue to admire. They developed a material culture so distinctive, so consistent across such a wide geographic area and such a long span of time, that it constitutes one of the clearest examples in the archaeological record of a coherent, persistent cultural tradition. They are known today as the Dorset culture, named for Cape Dorset on Baffin Island, where their artifacts were first recognized and described. But their own name for themselves, if they had one in the sense that we use the word, a collective identity, a term of self-reference, is lost. Nothing they said or thought or believed has survived in any form that can be recovered. What survives is stone, tools, figurines, carvings of animals and human faces rendered with a delicacy that suggests not just skill, but feeling, not just technique, but something that might be called an interior life. And then, approximately 500 years ago, they disappeared. Not slowly, not through a gradual mixing with other populations, or a long decline into smaller and smaller numbers. The archaeological record shows that across the entirety of their range, from Alaska to Greenland, the Dorset culture ends. The distinctive tool types stop appearing. The carved figurines stop being made. The specific style of house construction, the particular methods of food storage, the unique artistic conventions, all of it stops across an enormous geographic area within a relatively short period of time. What happened to them has been debated for decades. The leading hypothesis is that they encountered the Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, who expanded eastward out of Alaska approximately 1,000 years ago, following the bowhead whale, and carrying with them a technological package that included the large skin boat, the dog sled, and a social organization suited to cooperative hunting at a scale that the Dorset people apparently did not practice. The Thule were, by most measures, better equipped for the conditions of the Canadian Arctic. They moved faster, traveled farther, hunted larger prey, and may have been able to exploit resources that the Dorset people could not. But when the ancient DNA results came back, the picture became stranger and more troubling than a simple story of cultural replacement. The genetic analysis, published in a landmark 2014 paper in Science and refined by subsequent studies, showed that the Dorset people were not just culturally distinct from the Thule and from other Native American populations. They were genetically distinct in a way that was profound and surprising. Their genetic profile placed them in a separate branch of the human family tree, one that diverged from the ancestors of other Indigenous Americans at an early point in the peopling of the continent, and then remained isolated, maintaining its distinctiveness across 4,000 years of Arctic habitation, without significant mixing with any neighboring group. And when the researchers compared the Dorset genetic profile against the genomes of modern populations, they found something that required careful reading of the data and then rereading, because it seemed at first like it must be an error. The Dorset people have no known descendants. The Thule expansion that ended their archaeological record apparently ended their genetic legacy as well. There are no living people on Earth who can be shown to carry a meaningful proportion of Dorset ancestry. A population that existed for 4,000 years, that spread across one of the largest continuous geographic ranges of any prehistoric culture in the Americas, that left thousands of artifacts and dozens of excavated sites, is simply gone from the human genetic record, replaced entirely, without a trace in any living genome. This is extraordinarily rare in human prehistory. When populations encounter each other, they almost always mix. The genetic record of humanity is a record of admixture, of populations flowing into each other, of ancestry passing through unexpected channels, of genetic material from groups that no longer exist as cultural entities persisting in the genomes of their descendants. Even when populations are conquered, displaced, or dramatically reduced, some genetic continuity usually survives. The Neanderthals, who went extinct as a species, left their DNA in the genomes of every non-African person alive today. The Denisovans, known from a handful of bone fragments found in a single Siberian cave, have descendants, partial descendants, fractional descendants, but real ones, in populations across Asia and the Pacific. The Dorset people left nothing, or if they left something, it is so small and so buried beneath subsequent genetic layers that current technology cannot detect it. They existed. They were real. The artifacts are real. The bones are real. The extracted DNA is real. And then they stopped, and the world continued without them. And today, no living person carries the signature of their particular branch of the human tree. To understand how this could happen, you have to understand the geography of the encounter. The Canadian Arctic is not a place that rewards inefficiency. The margin for error in the far north is extremely thin. A failed hunt, a miscalculated storm, an injury at the wrong moment, these things can be fatal in ways that they are not in more temperate environments. And the Dorset people, for all their cultural sophistication and their 4,000 years of Arctic expertise, appear to have been operating with a narrower technological toolkit than the Thule who replaced them. They did not have the large skin boat known as the umiak, which allowed the Thule to hunt bowhead whales cooperatively, whales that represent an enormous caloric return on the investment of a single successful hunt. They did not have the dog sled in the form the Thule used it. Their tools, while refined, were lighter and smaller, suited to the hunting of smaller prey and to a more individualized or small group style of subsistence. When the Thule expanded eastward, and the archaeological record shows that this expansion was relatively rapid, moving across the Canadian Arctic in what may have been just a few centuries, they appear to have simply outcompeted the Dorset for resources, not necessarily through direct violence, though that cannot be ruled out, perhaps through the more impersonal mechanism of ecological displacement. Two groups competing for the same food resources, one with substantially greater efficiency in obtaining those resources, the other gradually declining until the population fell below the threshold of viability. A few remaining groups, perhaps, isolated in marginal areas, dwindling, and then nothing. There are Inuit oral traditions that mention a people called the Tunit, or Tunit, small, strong, gentle, not warlike, living in the land before the Inuit arrived. The descriptions are fragmentary and filtered through centuries of oral transmission, but scholars of Arctic history have noted their correspondence with what the archaeological record suggests about the Dorset people. They were there. The Inuit knew they were there, and then they were not. But the Dorset people are not the only mystery embedded in the ancient DNA of Canada. They are not even the oldest one. Go back further. Go back past the Dorset, past the Thule, past the cultures that built the Thule, past the cultures that built the elaborate mound complexes of the Great Lakes region and the intricate trade networks of the Hopewell tradition, past the first cultivation of corn along the St. Lawrence Valley, past all of the layered complexity of the last several thousand years of Indigenous history in North America. Go back to the moment when people first arrived on this continent, whenever that was and however it happened, and you encounter a question that has been generating controversy in the world of paleoanthropology for decades, and that the ancient DNA revolution has made simultaneously more urgent and more complicated. Who were the first people in the Americas? The answer that dominated academic consensus for most of the 20th century was clean and simple. The Clovis people, named for the town of Clovis, New Mexico, where their distinctive fluted stone projectile points were first identified in the 1930s. The Clovis culture appeared in the archaeological record approximately 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly across North and South America. The prevailing model held that a small founding population had crossed from Siberia into Alaska via the Bering Land Bridge, the broad expanse of land known as Beringia that connected Asia and North America when sea levels were lower during the Ice Age, and then moved south through an ice-free corridor that opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets as the glaciers began to retreat, reaching the interior of North America and expanding across the continent with remarkable speed. This model was elegant. It explained the distribution of Clovis sites across North America. It fit with what was known about the timing of deglaciation, and for decades it was defended with considerable vigor against any evidence that seemed to suggest an earlier human presence in the Americas. Evidence that was characterized sometimes with a sharpness that reflected more than mere academic disagreement, as unreliable, contaminated, or simply wrong. But the evidence kept accumulating. Monte Verde, in southern Chile, excavated by Tom Dillehay over several decades beginning in the 1970s, produced artifacts and organic remains with radiocarbon dates clustering around 14,500 years ago, 1,500 years before the Clovis horizon, and at a location so far south of the supposed entry point in Alaska that the Clovis first timeline was nearly impossible to reconcile with it. The site was contested for years. Dillehay's dates were challenged. His methodology was scrutinized. A group of archaeologists visited the site and came away convinced that the dates were real and the site was legitimate. The Clovis first model began to crack. Then came the genetic evidence, and the genetic evidence was not kind to the simple model. Studies of ancient DNA from indigenous American populations, combined with modeling of population genetics, began to reveal a picture of the peopling of the Americas that was far more complicated than a single founding population, crossing a single land bridge at a single moment in time. The data suggested multiple migration events. It suggested that the founding population of the Americas may have spent a substantial period of time, perhaps many thousands of years, isolated in Beringia, accumulating the specific genetic signatures that would later differentiate Native Americans from their Asian relatives before moving south into the continent. And it suggested that somewhere in the deep prehistory of the Americas, there was a population, or populations, that did not fit neatly into any of the expected categories. In 2018, researchers analyzing ancient DNA from the remains of 2 infants found at the Upward Sun River site in Alaska, infants who had been buried together approximately 11,500 years ago, identified a genetic signature that they had not seen before. One of the infants belonged to a lineage that connected clearly to other known Native American populations. The other infant belonged to something else, a distinct ancestral group, a lineage that had diverged from the ancestors of other Native Americans approximately 20,000 years ago, and then followed a separate trajectory. Living in Beringia and the far northwest of the continent, occupying a different ecological niche, maintaining their genetic distinctiveness across millennia, and ultimately disappearing from the genetic record without contributing meaningfully to the ancestry of any known modern population. The researchers named this group the ancient Beringians. The ancient Beringians are not Canadians in any meaningful sense of the word. They are associated primarily with the far northwest, Alaska, and the coastal zones of what is now the Yukon, but the implications of their existence ripple outward across the continent, including deep into what is now Canadian territory. If the ancient Beringians were present in the far northwest, and if they were a distinct founding population that preceded or accompanied the ancestors of other Native Americans, then the story of who first arrived in Canada and what happened to the people who were already there when subsequent waves arrived becomes a story not of a single population spreading across an empty land, but of multiple groups, genetically distinct, potentially culturally distinct, occupying different territories and encountering each other over the course of thousands of years with outcomes that varied from peaceful coexistence to violent replacement. The site of On Your Knees Cave on Prince of Wales Island in southeastern Alaska, a location that sits at the boundary zone between Alaska and what is now British Columbia, produced skeletal remains in 1996 that were dated to approximately 10,300 years ago, making them among the oldest human remains found on the northwest coast. The individual, given the name Shukaka in the Tlingit language, meaning man ahead of us, showed a mitochondrial haplogroup that connected him to a lineage present in some modern indigenous populations of the Americas, suggesting, at least in that case, some degree of genetic continuity between the ancient coastal inhabitants and their modern counterparts. But Shukaka is one data point. The picture built from multiple data points is more complex, and in some respects more unsettling than any single case. The coastal migration hypothesis, the idea that the first Americans moved not through the interior, ice-free corridor, but along the coast, using watercraft to navigate the kelp-rich coastal zones that ran from northeastern Asia through Beringia and down the Pacific coast of North America, has gained considerable traction in recent years, supported by the accumulation of coastal archaeological sites with dates that precede the opening of the interior corridor. The hypothesis requires that people were capable of open water navigation at least 15,000 years ago, which is not inherently implausible, given that Australia was settled by seafarers at least 50,000 years ago, and that the Pacific was being explored by ocean-going people well before the last ice age ended. But the coastal hypothesis creates its own set of mysteries, because if people were moving along the coast during the glacial maximum, when sea levels were lower and the coastline sat at depths that are now beneath tens of meters of ocean, then most of the sites where they lived are now submerged. The evidence of the earliest coastal inhabitants of British Columbia may be sitting on the seafloor, inaccessible to conventional excavation, visible only in the sonar imaging of underwater surveys or in the occasional artifact brought up by fishing nets or exposed by the shifting of submarine sediments. The drowned forests that fishermen and divers encounter off the BC coast are not merely ecological curiosities. They are markers of a landscape that was inhabited, and the question of who was living on that landscape when it was dry land is one that current archaeology can only partially answer. What underwater archaeology has found in the limited surveys that have been conducted in British Columbia's coastal waters include stone tools, hearths, and the remains of shell middens at depths consistent with sea levels during the late Pleistocene. These finds are difficult to date precisely and difficult to contextualize without the excavation methodology that is straightforward on dry land and enormously challenging underwater. But they confirm that the coast was being used, that people were there at times when the interior of the continent was largely sealed beneath glacial ice. The question of who those people were, genetically, culturally, linguistically, is one that the ancient DNA record can only partially answer, because the preservation of ancient DNA is highly dependent on temperature and chemistry, and the coastal environments of the Pacific Northwest are not uniformly good preservers of biological material. Cold is generally beneficial for DNA preservation. Wet is generally not. The cool, wet, acidic soils of the BC coast present a challenging environment for ancient biomolecules, which means that many of the most promising archaeological sites, those that might contain the bones of the earliest coastal inhabitants, may not yield the genetic data that would allow those inhabitants to be placed in the human family tree. There are exceptions. Cave sites, where temperatures are more stable and moisture is moderated, can preserve ancient DNA remarkably well, and it is from cave sites in British Columbia and in the neighboring regions of southeastern Alaska that some of the most interesting data has emerged. The Shukaka material from On Your Knees Cave is one example. Another comes from the analysis of ancient remains found in the Charlie Lake Cave site in northeastern British Columbia, which produced evidence of human occupation dating to approximately 10,500 years ago, shortly after the ice retreated from that part of the province and the land became habitable for the first time since the glacial maximum. The individuals associated with this site appear to represent an early population of the interior that moved in quickly behind the retreating ice front, tracking the herds of game animals that were expanding their ranges into newly available territory. But these sites, as interesting as they are, do not represent the deepest mystery. The deepest mystery lies in a different kind of evidence, not individual sites or individual skeletal samples, but in the overall pattern that emerges when you look at the genetic diversity of ancient North American populations across time and compare it to the diversity of modern indigenous populations. What that comparison reveals is a set of ancestral lineages that existed in ancient North America, but that are not, or are only very weakly, represented in any modern indigenous population. These are not small marginal lineages that might be explained by sampling error or by the limitations of current genomic databases. They are substantial branches of the human family tree that appear in the ancient record, persist for thousands of years, and then simply stop, as abruptly and as completely as the Dorset culture stops, but in cases that predate the Dorset by many thousands of years. The technical term for a genetic lineage that existed in the past but is absent or nearly absent in modern populations is a ghost population, not because there is anything supernatural about it, but because such a population is known only through indirect evidence, through the faint signals it left in the genomes of individuals who mixed with it, through the mathematical inference of population geneticists working backward from modern genetic diversity to reconstruct the populations that must have existed to produce it. Ghost populations are a recognized feature of human prehistory around the world. The Denisovans were, for a long time, a ghost population, known only through their genetic signal in modern human genomes, before the discovery of physical remains in Denisova Cave confirmed that they were real. In North America, and specifically in Canada, there are indications of ghost populations, ancestral groups that contributed to the genetic makeup of early inhabitants of the continent, but that left no known modern descendants, and that have not yet been identified through the recovery of physical remains. These populations are inferred from statistical modeling of ancient DNA datasets, from the identification of genetic variants in ancient individuals that cannot be derived from any known source population, from the patterns of admixture that suggest the presence of a third or fourth ancestral stream, flowing into the early Americans alongside the better documented founding lineages. What this means, in plain language, is that the peopling of the Americas was not a simple story. It was not 2 waves or 3 waves of migration across Beringia, each neatly replacing or assimilating the one before. It was something more complex, more ancient, and more varied, a process that involved multiple populations, some of which no longer have any living representatives, moving through a landscape that was itself changing rapidly as the ice retreated and the sea level rose, and the ecological zones of the continent shifted northward, and the animals that early peoples depended on for food either adapted or went extinct. The megafauna extinctions of the late Pleistocene, the disappearance of mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, American horses, giant beavers, and dozens of other large animal species that had dominated the North American landscape for millions of years, occurred during or just after the period when humans were arriving in force. The cause of these extinctions has been debated at length, with arguments divided between climate change, the rapid warming and ecological transformation that followed the glacial maximum, and overkill, the sudden arrival of skilled human hunters who had no prior evolutionary relationship with the megafauna and whom the animals had not developed defenses against. The current consensus leans toward a combination of both factors, with human pressure being particularly important for certain species in certain regions. What the megafauna extinctions meant for the early human populations of Canada was a fundamental disruption of the subsistence base. The cultures that had organized their lives around hunting mammoths or mastodons were suddenly without their primary prey. Some adapted, shifted to smaller game, increased their reliance on fish and shellfish and plant foods. Others may not have adapted quickly enough. The period immediately following the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, appears from the archaeological record to have been one of significant population stress and rearrangement across North America, with some regions being abandoned and others being colonized for the first time, and with the genetic record showing what looks like a substantial reduction in effective population size in some lineages, the signature of a population bottleneck, of a group that was reduced to a small fraction of its former size and then rebuilt from that reduced base. The populations that did not survive those bottlenecks, that were reduced past the threshold of recovery, that dwindled and fragmented and finally disappeared, wouldn't appear in the modern genetic record. They would be ghosts, known perhaps by the bones they left behind in caves and river sediments, by the tools they shaped from stone and left in archaeological layers that later researchers would excavate with fine brushes and grid surveys, known perhaps by ancient DNA that no longer has any living analog, known as a presence in the past that simply did not translate into a presence in the future. There is a site in northwestern British Columbia, in a region of mountains and river valleys that remain sparsely populated today, and that would have been among the first areas to emerge from beneath glacial ice as the Cordilleran ice sheet retreated, where researchers conducting a systematic survey found human skeletal material in a context that dated to approximately 9,000 years ago. The physical characteristics of the remains placed them outside the range of variation typically associated with known early American populations. The skull morphology was different. Morphology was not dramatically different, not belonging to some other species, but different in ways that were statistically significant and that did not correspond to the physical characteristics of other known ancient North American individuals from the same time period. Physical anthropologists have long observed that the earliest known human remains from the Americas, those dating to before approximately 8,000 years ago, show skull shapes and facial architectures that differ from those of later and more recent Native American populations. The terminology used to describe this is contentious, and the interpretation of what it means is more contentious still. But the observation itself is robust. The oldest Americans look different from later Americans, and the question of what that morphological difference means in terms of population history and genetic relatedness is one that the ancient DNA revolution has addressed directly, with results that are complicated. In some cases, the ancient DNA of early Americans with unusual morphology shows that they belong to founding Native American lineages. That is, they are ancestral to modern Native Americans, just earlier and less derived in the specific physical traits that became more common as populations grew and mixed and adapted. In other cases, the ancient DNA of morphologically unusual early Americans shows something different, a genetic signature that places them outside the expected tree of Native American ancestry that cannot be derived straightforwardly from the known founding populations, that requires the invocation of an additional ancestral source, another population, another stream of ancestry, another group of people who arrived in the Americas through a route and at a time that the standard models do not account for. The Lutzia skeleton, found in Brazil and dating to approximately 10,000 years ago, is the most famous example of this puzzle in South America. A woman whose skull shape was interpreted by some physical anthropologists as bearing similarities to populations of Australasia rather than to the Northeast Asian populations from which most Native Americans are believed to descend, and whose genetic analysis has been partial and contested but suggestive of an unusual ancestry. The Spirit Cave mummy, found in Nevada and dating to approximately 10,700 years ago, showed a genetic profile that was consistent with Native American ancestry, but positioned at an unexpectedly deep and divergent branch of the tree. The Kennewick man skeleton from Washington State, at approximately 8,500 years old, was the subject of a legal battle between scientists and indigenous tribes that lasted nearly a decade, and that produced, when the genetic analysis was finally completed, a result showing relatedness to modern indigenous Americans, specifically to the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, but also indicating a position in the family tree that represented an early and partially distinct branch of the peopling of the Americas. These cases collectively suggest something that is becoming harder to dismiss, that the founding of the Americas was not a single, clean event, but a complicated, multi-layered process involving populations of varying origins and genetic compositions, some of which left descendants in the modern world and some of which did not, and that the full accounting of that process will require a great deal more evidence from a great deal more sites before any confident reconstruction becomes possible. In Canada, the sites that are most likely to yield that evidence are distributed across a geographic range that reflects the multiple routes by which the continent was initially populated. The Arctic coast and the islands of the high Arctic contain the record of the Paleo-Eskimos and their mysterious disappearance. The northwest coast and the offshore islands of British Columbia contain the record of the early coastal inhabitants, people who were living along a shoreline that no longer exists, many of whose sites are now beneath the ocean. The interior plateau of British Columbia, the boreal forests of the northern prairies, the river valleys of the Yukon, all of these regions have yielded, or have the potential to yield, archaeological and genetic evidence that speaks to questions about the earliest occupants of Canada and their relationship to the populations that came after them. The challenge of doing this science in Canada is complicated by factors that go beyond the merely technical. The history of the relationship between the academic study of Indigenous history and living Indigenous communities in Canada is not a comfortable one. The collection of skeletal remains from Indigenous burial sites was conducted for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, without the consent or even the knowledge of descendant communities. Taken for study, catalogued, stored in museum collections, sometimes lost or improperly recorded, and eventually made the subject of repatriation claims as Indigenous communities sought the return of their ancestors' remains for proper burial according to their own traditions. The legal framework for the study of ancient human remains in Canada, and for the genetic analysis of those remains, has become substantially more careful and consultative in recent decades, reflecting a broader acknowledgement of Indigenous rights and sovereignty that was largely absent from earlier generations of research. This is not a simple obstacle to good science. It is, in many cases, an opportunity for better science, because the Indigenous communities of Canada, approached as partners, rather than as objects of study, bring knowledge and perspective to the interpretation of the archaeological and genetic record that the purely technical analysis of bones and DNA cannot provide on its own. The oral traditions of the Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, the Heiltsuk, the Nisga'a, the Gitxsan, and dozens of other First Nations of the northwest coast contain information about the ancient past of the region, about landscape changes, about population movements, about relationships between groups, that has repeatedly been corroborated by the physical evidence when that evidence has been collected and analyzed. The Triquet Island story is one example. There are others. The Heiltsuk Nation, whose traditional territory encompasses the central coast of British Columbia, including the area around Triquet Island, received the news of the 14,000-year-old occupation dates with a response that contained, alongside genuine excitement, a note of vindication. They had always known they had been there that long. The academic world had simply not believed them, or had not been looking in the right places with the right tools until recently. The knowledge was not new. The corroboration was. This dynamic, Indigenous oral knowledge, preceding and then being confirmed by Western scientific investigation, is not an anomaly in the archaeology of Canada. It is a recurring pattern, and it raises a question that goes beyond the merely methodological. If the oral traditions of living Indigenous communities have consistently preserved accurate information about events that occurred thousands of years ago, what else do they preserve? What other aspects of the deep past are encoded in stories and ceremonies and place names and the accumulated knowledge of communities that have maintained their relationship to this land across time scales that Western historical consciousness has only recently begun to appreciate? Some of those traditions speak, in various ways, of encounters with other peoples who were different, who were already there when the speaker's ancestors arrived, who lived in certain areas or used certain resources, and who eventually disappeared or were absorbed. These are not, for the most part, the kind of specific, datable accounts that a historian can cross-reference against a written record. They are fragmentary and elusive, processed through oral transmission and cultural adaptation, shaped by the concerns of the communities that preserve them. But they are consistent with a picture of the deep past that the genetic and archaeological evidence is increasingly confirming. A past in which the land that is now Canada was not a blank slate settled by a single founding population, but a palimpsest inhabited by multiple groups over vast spans of time, some of whom left descendants, and some of whom did not, some of whom mixed with their neighbors, and some of whom maintained a fierce and ultimately unsuccessful distinctiveness. Return now to the laboratory, to the specific mechanics of how ancient DNA is recovered and what it can and cannot tell us. A bone sample, a tooth, a fragment of dense cortical bone from the inner ear region, a piece of the petrous bone at the base of the skull, which tends to be among the best preserved sources of ancient DNA, is first cleaned of surface contamination, then ground to a fine powder in a sterile environment. The powder is dissolved in a buffer solution that releases the DNA from the cellular structures where it was originally housed. The released DNA is then captured and purified and prepared into a library, a collection of short DNA fragments that can be sequenced using high-throughput sequencing machines that read millions of fragments simultaneously. The resulting raw data is a massive pile of short sequences, most of which represent the DNA of bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms that colonize the remains after death, and whose genetic material vastly outnumbers the genetic material of the original individual. Filtering out the contaminating DNA to recover the authentic human sequences requires computational tools and reference databases and a great deal of statistical reasoning. Even when the filtering is done well, the recovered human genome is typically incomplete. A fraction of the full 3 billion base pairs that constitute a human genome, with coverage that varies enormously depending on the quality of the sample and the conditions of preservation. From this imperfect data, geneticists reconstruct as much as they can the sex of the individual, their mitochondrial haplogroup, which traces the maternal lineage, their Y chromosome haplogroup if they were male, which traces the paternal lineage, and ideally a substantial portion of the nuclear genome that can be compared against reference populations to determine ancestry. The comparisons are done using statistical methods, principal components analysis, admixture modeling, F statistics, D statistics, that are powerful but not infallible, that have assumptions built into them that can affect results, and that are dependent on the completeness and representativeness of the reference datasets they use for comparison. This means that the identification of a genetic profile as matching no known population is not a simple binary determination. It is a statement about the current state of reference, databases, and analytical methods. A profile that matches nothing today might match something tomorrow when a new ancient DNA dataset is published that fills a gap in the sampling of human genetic diversity. The history of ancient DNA research is full of cases where a result that seemed anomalous at one time was explained by a subsequent discovery, where a mystery population turned out to be an unsampled branch of a known group, or where a genetic signal that looked exotic was shown to result from a poorly understood admixture event. But the history of ancient DNA research is also full of cases where the anomaly held up, where subsequent discoveries confirmed rather than resolve the mystery, where the gap in the reference database was not a sampling artifact, but a genuine reflection of a real absence, the absence of living descendants. The Dorset case is one where the anomaly held up. The ancient Beringian case is one where the anomaly held up. And there are others, less dramatic, less completely resolved, but pointing in the same direction, cases from British Columbia and the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, where ancient remains have been analyzed, and the results have shown genetic profiles that sit at the margins or outside the expected distributions, that require explanation in terms of population history that cannot yet be provided with confidence. What makes Canada particularly interesting as a theater for these investigations, beyond the quality of some of its archaeological sites and the richness of its Indigenous oral traditions, is its geographic position at the junction of multiple proposed migration routes. The Arctic coast was a highway for the Paleo-Eskimo populations moving east from Alaska. The Northwest coast was potentially a corridor for coastal migrants moving south from Beringia before the glaciers retreated. The interior corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets was, when it opened approximately 14,000 years ago, a pathway for populations moving from interior Alaska into the interior of North America, and the eastern Arctic, the subarctic boreal zone, the Great Plains. All of these regions have their own archaeological records, their own ancient DNA datasets beginning to be assembled, their own mysteries embedded in the remains of people who lived and died in the deep past. The convergence of these roots in the geography of Canada means that the genetic diversity of ancient Canadian populations may have been particularly high, that the country was a zone of encounter between groups that had diverged from common ancestors many thousands of years earlier, and then come back into contact, carrying with them the accumulated genetic and cultural differences of long isolation. Such zones of contact are where the most interesting things happen in population genetics, where admixture produces new combinations, where competition produces selection, where some lineages are amplified and others are lost, not through any intrinsic superiority or inferiority, but through the contingent workings of history, of who happened to be in the right place when a resource was abundant, of who happened to encounter a disease, or a drought, or a conflict at the wrong moment. The study of ancient DNA from Canada is still young. The data sets are small compared to what has been accumulated for Europe, where thousands of ancient individuals have been genotyped, and where the major episodes of population turnover, the arrival of the first farmers from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago, the expansion of steppe pastoralists from the Pontic, Caspian steppe around 5,000 years ago, have been documented in considerable detail. For North America, and particularly for Canada, the sample sizes are much smaller, the geographic coverage much patchier, the temporal resolution much coarser. But the field is growing. Collaborative projects between universities, museums, and Indigenous communities are expanding the data set. New excavations are being conducted with ancient DNA recovery as a primary goal, using protocols that preserve biological material in ways that earlier excavations did not. Old museum collections are being revisited with the appropriate permissions and consultations to extract genetic information from specimens that were collected generations ago. And new analytical methods are being developed that can extract meaningful information from samples that would previously have been considered too degraded to analyze. Each new ancient genome added to the dataset for Canada adds resolution to the picture. Sometimes the new data confirms what was already suspected. Sometimes it complicates a model that seemed to be converging on a consensus, and occasionally, not often, but often enough to be significant, it adds a new mystery, a new profile that doesn't match, a new branch of the tree that has no known living relatives, a new ghost. There is a concept in ecology called the shifting baseline, the idea that each generation calibrates its sense of what is normal, what is natural, what is the baseline state of the environment, according to the conditions that existed at the beginning of that generation's conscious awareness of the world. A biologist who grew up in the 20th century thinks of certain fish populations as depleted because they are dramatically smaller than they were in the 19th century. A 19th century biologist would have thought those same populations depleted compared to the 18th century, and so on, backward through time, with each generation accepting the diminished world it inherited as the normal world, because it has no direct experience of anything else. The same dynamic applies to our understanding of human diversity. The diversity of human populations that exist today is the baseline we work from. The populations alive now are the ones we can study most easily, most completely, most affordably. And so there is a natural tendency to assume that the populations alive now represent something close to the full range of human genetic diversity, that the reference databases compiled from modern populations, however incomplete, are at least roughly representative of the full space of human variation that has existed through evolutionary time. Ancient DNA is dismantling that assumption. It is revealing that the diversity of past human populations was substantially greater than the diversity of modern populations, that the deep past contained branches of the human family tree that no longer exist, that went extinct, or were absorbed, or were replaced, and that the modern world is, in a sense, an impoverished version of the world of 10,000 or 20,000 years ago in terms of the range of distinct human genetic lineages that existed. The planet is more connected now. Populations that were once isolated have mixed. Lineages that might have maintained their distinctiveness in a world of smaller, more separated groups have been absorbed into the larger genetic mixing pools of historical and modern populations. Canada is a place where some of those lost lineages existed, where people lived for thousands of years, left their bones and their tools, and occasionally, if the conditions were right, their DNA in the sediment, where the genetic archive of humanity's deep past is preserved in scattered, fragmentary, imperfectly accessible form, waiting for the right excavation, the right laboratory analysis, the right moment of recognition, when a researcher looks at a result and understands that what they are looking at is not an error, but a reality, not a contaminated sample, but the genuine biological signature of a person who lived and breathed and looked at these mountains and these rivers and these shores at a time so remote that the world they knew is barely imaginable. The people who match no known population on Earth are not a warning or a portent. They are an invitation to expand what we consider the full scope of human history, to make room in our understanding for populations that did not survive to tell their own stories, to listen more carefully to the communities that did survive and that have been keeping records of the deep past in forms that do not require paper or stone to endure. They are a reminder that the history of this continent began long before any of the names we use for it, Canada, America, the New World, the Americas, had been spoken by anyone, and that the people who walked this land before the ice retreated and the sea level rose, and the known world began, were no less real, no less complete, no less full of humanity, for the fact that they left no descendants who can speak for them today. Their bones are in the earth. Their DNA, when it can be recovered, is in the machines of university laboratories and research institutes, being read by researchers who are trying to understand, one fragmented genome at a time, who they were. The work is slow and incomplete, and will remain incomplete for the foreseeable future. But it is being done, and each answer that emerges from it, even when, especially when, that answer takes the form of a new question, adds something to the picture of what this land was and who was living on it before anyone thought to write it down. The kelp forests that line the BC coast, those underwater jungles of golden brown fronds that sway in the current and shelter an extraordinary density of marine life, were present in some form during the late Pleistocene, when the lower sea level would have placed the kelp zone in different locations relative to the modern coastline. The coastal peoples of that era, if they were using the marine resources of those early kelp forests, the sea otters, the sea urchins, the rockfish, the halibut, the salmon that ran in the rivers draining from the newly deglaciated highlands, would have had a productive and reliable food base. They would have been able to maintain permanent settlements, or something close to permanent, in the zones where the kelp forest met the river mouth and both aquatic and terrestrial resources were available. The evidence of those settlements is mostly gone now, taken by the sea. But occasionally, in shallow coastal waters off the BC coast, survey vessels equipped with multibeam sonar produce images of the seafloor that show features that are not geological in origin: linear structures, depressions, concentrations of shell material that suggest the presence of ancient human activity in areas that were dry land during the glacial maximum and the early post-glacial period. These features are difficult to excavate and difficult to date without physical samples retrieved from the seafloor, but they exist and they are being documented, and at some point the technology and the resources and the collaborative frameworks will be in place to investigate them properly. What will be found when that investigation happens is unknown. It might confirm the coastal migration hypothesis decisively. It might reveal material culture that connects clearly to known archaeological traditions of the northwest coast. Or it might find something that doesn't fit, artifacts or biological material from people who cannot be placed in any known tradition, who represent a chapter of the settlement history of the BC coast that is not recorded anywhere else in the archaeological or genetic record. The history of ancient DNA research in Canada suggests that the second possibility is at least as likely as the first. The field has been full of surprises. The surprises have consistently pointed in the direction of greater complexity, greater antiquity, greater diversity than the prevailing models predicted. There is no particular reason to expect that the next round of discoveries will be any different. There is a term used in the study of population genetics, effective population size, which refers not to the actual number of individuals in a population at any given moment, but to the number of individuals who actually contribute offspring to the next generation, adjusted for the variance in reproductive success and for the sex ratio of the breeding population. The effective population size is almost always smaller than the census population size, sometimes dramatically so, and it is the effective population size that determines how genetic diversity is maintained or lost over time. Small effective populations lose genetic diversity rapidly through the process of genetic drift, the random loss of alleles when by chance certain variants are not passed on to the next generation. Large effective populations maintain diversity more stably. The early human populations of Canada in the millennia immediately following the first settlement of the continent were almost certainly small, not just in absolute numbers, but in effective population size, because they were distributed across a vast geography in small, isolated or semi-isolated groups, and because the conditions of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, the rapid ecological changes, the megafaunal extinctions, the shifting of climate zones, would have created periodic bottlenecks that reduced populations to remnants. Small isolated groups experiencing genetic drift could diverge quite rapidly from their parent populations and from each other, accumulating genetic differences that would appear in a later analysis as evidence of a distinct population. This is one mechanism by which the no known match results in ancient Canadian DNA might be explained, not as truly exotic or mysterious populations, but as extreme drift variants of founding lineages, small groups that were isolated long enough to develop highly distinctive genetic profiles before being absorbed into larger populations or going extinct. This explanation is less dramatic than the alternatives, but it is scientifically respectable and consistent with what is known about the genetics of small, isolated populations in general. The problem with this explanation is that it requires the populations in question to have been isolated for very long periods, long enough to accumulate the specific combinations of rare alleles and unusual haplogroup distributions that mark them as distinct in modern analyses. And the timescales involved are not trivial. The kind of genetic distinctiveness seen in the Dorset people, for example, implies an isolation that lasted not centuries but millennia, a population that remained separate from its neighbors across the entire span of its 4,000-year presence in the Canadian Arctic, without the admixture that almost always characterizes neighboring human groups over such spans of time. Whether that isolation was maintained by geographic barriers, the vast distances of the Arctic, the seasonal impassability of sea ice, or by cultural and social barriers, the deliberate maintenance of endogamy, of marriage practices that kept genetic exchange within the group, or by some combination of both, is a question that cannot be answered from the genetic data alone. It requires the integration of multiple types of evidence: the geographic distribution of sites, the material culture of the artifacts found in them, the timing of their appearance and disappearance, and the interpretation of all of these data in light of what is known about human behavioral ecology in comparable environments. The intersection of all of this evidence, the DNA, the artifacts, the site distributions, the oral traditions, the ecological models, is where the most interesting science is being done, and it is producing a portrait of the deep human history of Canada that is richer, stranger, and more emotionally resonant than the old simple story of a single founding population, crossing a land bridge and spreading across an empty continent. Empty is the word that keeps coming back, and it is the word most worth examining. The land that became Canada was not empty when the first people arrived. By definition, of course, because if there were first people, then the land they arrived in was empty before them. But the word empty has been applied to the post-ice age Americas in ways that are not merely descriptive, but rhetorical, ways that serve to simplify a complicated history and to minimize the depth of the human presence that preceded European contact. The land was not empty. It was full of diverse peoples with deep roots and long histories and complex relationships to each other and to the land itself, relationships that had been built and modified and complicated over thousands of years by exactly the kinds of encounters, replacements, and absorptions that the ancient DNA record is now beginning to document. The people who match no known population on Earth are part of that fullness. They are evidence that the human history of Canada is older than we thought, more diverse than we thought, and more complicated than any simple narrative. Whether the narrative of a pristine wilderness discovered by Europeans or the narrative of a straightforward migration of a founding population across a land bridge can accommodate. They are a correction to the record, a reminder that the record has always been incomplete, that the incompleteness has not always been innocent, and that the work of making the record more complete is work that matters, scientifically, historically, and in ways that are harder to categorize, but no less real. The caves of British Columbia are still being explored. The seafloor off the coast is still being mapped. The museum collections are still being revisited with new analytical tools. The ancient DNA databases are still growing, one genome at a time, one sample at a time, one careful extraction from a tooth or a bone in a laboratory where the temperature is controlled and the contamination protocols are strict, and the researchers know that they are handling the remains of a person who lived in this land long before the land had a name, and that what they learn from those remains will change, in some measure, what we know about who has lived here and what happened to them. That work will continue. It will produce results that confirm, and results that surprise, and results that cannot yet be interpreted, because the framework for interpreting them does not yet exist. It will require patience and collaboration and a willingness to hold open questions without forcing them into premature resolution. And it will require, perhaps most of all, a recognition that the people whose remains are being studied were not mysteries waiting to be solved. They were people, fully realized, fully human, fully present in the world they inhabited, as real and as complex and as uncontainable as any person alive today. The ocean is rising again, incrementally, pushed by the warming that comes from everything burning. Along the coast of British Columbia, the low-lying areas are slowly changing. The marshes are shifting, the estuaries are widening, the shorelines are retreating a little more each decade. The drowned forests beneath the water are no closer to the surface than they were a generation ago. And somewhere beneath the cold green water, beneath the kelp and the rockfish and the moving silt, there are the places where people lived 14,000 years ago and 17,000 years ago, and perhaps longer still, living on land that is now gone, belonging to populations that have no names in any language spoken today, and no descendants in any genome database yet assembled. They are not gone in the sense of having never existed. They existed. The bones are proof. The DNA, partial, fragmented, ancient, real, is proof. The drowned landscape they inhabited is proof, preserved in the sonar images and the sediment cores and the occasional artifact brought up from the deep. They existed, and they lived full lives in a land that was already beautiful even before anyone thought to call it beautiful, and they looked at the same mountains that are still there, and the same ocean that has only moved its edge, and they were as curious about the world as anyone has ever been, and they had no idea that they would someday be the mystery at the center of a scientific controversy that would outlast every civilization that has risen in the time since they disappeared. The ice age ended, the water rose, the forests moved north, the animals changed, and the people, the various distinct, genetically diverse, culturally sophisticated people who had made their lives in this land through the coldest and most difficult centuries of the Pleistocene, adapted, or moved, or were replaced, or simply ended. Some of them became the ancestors of the First Nations, the Inuit, the Métis, the living communities whose connection to this land is documented both in their traditions and in their DNA, stretching back further than most history acknowledges and still very much present. Others became something else, a signal in ancient data, a profile that matches nothing, a branch of the human family tree with no living leaves. The question of what happened to them is a question about the nature of survival, about what it takes for a lineage, a culture, a people, to persist through the upheavals of deep time, about the role of chance and geography and climate and encounter in determining which populations leave descendants and which do not, about whether there is a lesson in the extinction of the Dorset people and the ancient Beringians and the other ghost populations of Canada for a species that is now large enough and interconnected enough to be destroying the very systems that made its own survival possible. Perhaps there is. Perhaps the lesson is simply this, that no civilization is permanent, that the people who built Stonehenge did not know that Stonehenge would outlast their language, that the Dorset carvers who shaped those extraordinary animal figurines from walrus ivory and soapstone did not know they were making the last things their people would ever make, that the inhabitants of the pre-glacial coast of British Columbia, living in a landscape that the ocean had not yet reclaimed, did not know they were living in a landscape that would not last. They lived anyway, they made things, they fed their children, they told each other stories about the world and their place in it, stories that are gone now, as gone as their genes are gone from any living body, as gone as the land they walked on is gone beneath the water. What is not gone is the evidence that they were here, the bones, the DNA, the artifacts, the sites submerged and dry, the layer of organic material in a cave on Triquet Island that tells us that people were living on this coast when the ice was still thick, to the east and the north, and the world was still figuring out what shape it was going to take. The evidence is real, and it is, in the most literal sense, irreplaceable, because no new evidence of the deep past can be manufactured, only discovered, and the discoveries depend on conditions of preservation and the effort of recovery and the willingness to ask the question in the first place. The question was asked, the remains were found, the DNA was extracted and sequenced and compared against everything known about human genetic diversity, and the result came back, as it has come back in multiple laboratories across multiple decades. No match, no known descendants, a population that existed, that was real, that was here, and that belongs to a branch of the human family that we are only now, for the first time, beginning to understand we lost. There is another dimension to this story that has not yet been fully told, and it concerns not the genetics or the geology, but the mathematics of extinction, the specific conditions under which a human population becomes unrecoverable. Demographers and population geneticists have worked for decades to understand the dynamics of population viability, asking the question of how large a group must be and how connected to other groups to survive across multiple generations without collapsing under the weight of inbreeding, genetic drift, and the random shocks of environmental and social crisis. The answers are not comforting and they are not simple, but they converge on a general principle, that small populations in isolation are inherently fragile, that their fragility increases as their isolation increases, and that the transition from a viable population to an unviable one can happen rapidly, faster than the community's own social organization can adapt, faster than individuals can recognize and respond to the existential nature of the crisis they are in. The Dorset people, in their final centuries, may have been in exactly this situation. The archaeological record of the late Dorset period shows evidence of geographic contraction, a shrinking of the range, a retreat from the margins, a concentration of sites in the areas where resources were most reliable and where the Thule expansion had not yet penetrated. Whether this contraction was consciously managed, whether it represented a deliberate strategy of consolidation in the face of a growing threat, or whether it was simply the unplanned result of incremental losses of groups that failed to recover from a bad hunting season or a disease outbreak and were not replaced, is impossible to determine from the archaeological record alone. But the spatial pattern is clear. The Dorset were retreating and the Thule were advancing, and at some point the retreating population became small enough that recovery was no longer possible. This is not a unique event in human history. It is, in fact, a recurring one. The pattern of an expanding technologically superior population displacing and eventually eliminating a less technologically equipped resident population has been replicated many times across the human past, including in events much more recent and much better documented than the Dorset-Thule encounter. What makes the Dorset case interesting scientifically is the completeness of the genetic erasure, the near total absence of Dorset ancestry in modern populations, which suggests that the displacement was accomplished with very little admixture. The two populations appear to have remained genetically separate even during the period when they were in contact, occupying overlapping or adjacent territories. This is unusual. When populations are in contact for extended periods, admixture almost always occurs. The absence of admixture in the Dorset Thule case suggests either that contact was brief, that the replacement happened faster than the mixing could occur, or that there were strong cultural or social barriers to intermarriage between the two groups that prevented the genetic exchange that would otherwise have taken place. Some researchers have proposed a third possibility, that the Dorset population declined to very small numbers very quickly before any significant mixing could occur, and that by the time the Thule population was established throughout the former Dorset range, there were simply no Dorset individuals left to mix with. This explanation is consistent with the genetic data and with the archaeological record of rapid Dorset range contraction. It is also consistent with the Inuit oral traditions about the Tunit, which describe them as having been present in the land when the Inuit ancestors arrived, but as having retreated quickly in the face of the new arrivals, apparently not through violent conflict, but through a kind of mutual avoidance that may have reflected a cultural tendency toward withdrawal from confrontation rather than toward the defense of territory. Whether the Tunit of the oral traditions and the Dorset people of the archaeological record are the same group, described through two different lenses, is a question that has been discussed at length by Arctic archaeologists and scholars of Inuit oral tradition. The correspondences are suggestive enough that most researchers are willing to make a cautious identification, while acknowledging that oral traditions are transformed by the processes of transmission across generations, and that what the Inuit traditions preserve about the Tunit is necessarily filtered through the Inuit perspective on the encounter, a perspective in which the newcomers succeeded and the original inhabitants retreated, and the retreating inhabitants were characterized in ways that may or may not accurately reflect how they would have characterized themselves. What the Tunit stories do consistently convey, and this is one of the details that makes them compelling as a window into the ancient past, is a sense of the Tunit as very different from the Inuit. Different in body, stronger, capable of feats of physical strength that the Inuit storytellers find remarkable. Different in manner, gentle, easily startled, prone to flight rather than resistance. Different in their relationship to the land, apparently more sedentary, less mobile, tied to specific locations in ways that may have made them vulnerable to the competitive pressure of a more mobile group. And different in some quality that the oral traditions gesture at without quite naming. Something in their way of being in the world that set them apart from the people who replaced them. This last quality, whatever it was, is not something that genetics can recover. The genome tells us about ancestry and migration and the structure of populations. It does not tell us what language the Dorset people spoke, what they believed about the world, what ceremonies they performed in the short, dark winters of the high Arctic, what stories they told each other, and what those stories meant. All of that is gone, not because it was not real. It was real as the carved figurines, as real as the meticulously shaped stone tools, but because it was transmitted in forms that do not survive, in spoken words, in gesture and practice, in the memories that exist only in the minds of people who are alive and who pass them to other people who are alive. And when the last person who carries a particular piece of knowledge dies without having passed it on, it is gone. The epistemological situation is humbling. We are trying to reconstruct the human history of a continent from fragments, from bones and DNA and stone tools and the occasional charred seed from an ancient hearth, and the vast majority of what that history actually consisted of, the overwhelming bulk of the experience of the people who lived it, is irrecoverable. What we can know is partial, and the partiality is not evenly distributed. It favors the durable over the perishable, the material over the immaterial, the things that happen to survive over the things that should have survived but didn't, the communities that remain large enough to leave a genetic footprint in modern populations over the communities that disappeared without descendants. This is one reason why the ancient DNA revolution matters beyond the specific scientific questions it answers. It is expanding the category of the recoverable. It is allowing us to access, through the biological material preserved in bone and tooth, information about populations that left no material culture significant enough to preserve in an accessible form, that occupied environments where organic remains did not survive, that lived in the deep past before any written or even graphic record-keeping tradition existed. The genome is a text, and it is a text that can be read even when every other text that the person who carried it might have produced has been destroyed. But it is a text with significant limitations. It cannot tell us about the inner life of the individual whose bone we have sampled. It cannot tell us about their language or their beliefs or their social structure beyond what can be inferred from the population-level patterns of the genetic data. It tells us about ancestry, about where people came from and who they were related to. And from ancestry, we can build a picture of population history that is sometimes precise and sometimes gestural, sometimes confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence, and sometimes standing alone as the only surviving signal of a population that existed. In Canada, the ancient DNA record is currently sparse enough that most of what it tells us is gestural. We have data points, individual ancient genomes, or partial genomes, from a small number of sites distributed unevenly across a vast geography, and from those data points we are constructing a picture of population history that will need to be substantially refined as more data becomes available. The picture we currently have suggests a history of considerable complexity, multiple founding populations, multiple episodes of migration and replacement, multiple ghost lineages, and a genetic diversity in the ancient past that substantially exceeded the diversity of modern populations. That picture will change as the data improves. Some of the current mysteries will be resolved, explained by a new ancient genome that fills a gap, or by a new analytical method that reveals structure in existing data that was not previously detectable. Other mysteries will deepen, and some discoveries will be genuinely new, adding to the picture in ways that cannot currently be anticipated, because the data that would allow anticipation has not yet been collected. The river valleys of the Yukon are a place where the deep past is particularly close to the surface. The combination of permafrost, which preserves organic material in exceptional condition, with river erosion that continually exposes ancient sediment layers, creates conditions in which bones and plant material and even traces of ancient biomolecules are regularly brought to light by the natural processes of the landscape. The Old Crow Basin in northern Yukon has been the site of archaeological investigation for decades, and it has produced some of the oldest claimed evidence for human presence in the Americas, including a caribou. Tibia, fashioned into a tool that was initially dated to more than 20,000 years ago, a date that would have placed humans in the Yukon well before the last glacial maximum. That date was subsequently revised downward by new radiocarbon methods to approximately 1,400 years old, which was a significant correction and a reminder of the difficulties of dating organic material in permafrost environments, where ancient carbon can contaminate modern samples. But the Old Crow Basin has also produced undisputed evidence of human presence during the late Pleistocene, and ongoing work in the Yukon, in river cut banks and eroding permafrost exposures and carefully selected archaeological sites, continues to add to the record of early human activity in the far northwest. Some of this work is being conducted in collaboration with the Vuntut, Gwich'in, and other First Nations communities whose traditional territories encompass the Old Crow region and whose knowledge of the landscape, of where to look, of what kinds of features are associated with ancient deposits, of how the terrain has changed within living memory, is proving genuinely useful as a guide to where scientific investigation should be focused. The collaborative model being developed in the Yukon represents one possible template for the broader challenge of studying the deep human past of Canada in a way that is scientifically rigorous and ethically grounded. It acknowledges that the communities whose ancestors' remains are being studied have a legitimate interest in how those ancestors are represented and in what conclusions are drawn from the study of their remains. It creates mechanisms for community members to be involved in the research process, not just as informants or permit holders, but as intellectual contributors, bringing knowledge and perspective that academic archaeology by itself cannot generate. And it creates a framework for sharing the results of research with the communities that help make it possible, rather than simply publishing findings in academic journals that most community members will never read. This kind of collaboration does not resolve all of the tensions between scientific research and Indigenous community interests, and it would be naive to suggest that it does. There are cases where the scientific findings of ancient DNA analysis are in tension with oral traditions or with claims about ancestry that have cultural and political significance for living communities, cases where the data suggests that the people buried in a particular site were not closely related to the community that considers that site ancestral, or where the genetic picture of population history is more complicated and less continuous than a community's sense of its own history would suggest. These tensions are real, and they are not easily resolved, and the research community is still developing the norms and practices that will allow them to be navigated with the appropriate combination of scientific honesty and cultural sensitivity. But the direction of travel is clear. The era of archaeology conducted on Indigenous remains without consultation, without consent, and without any obligation to the communities whose heritage is being studied is ending, slowly in some places, more quickly in others, but ending. The next generation of research into the deep human past of Canada will be conducted differently than the last generation, and there is reason to hope that the results will be better for it, more carefully contextualized, more richly interpreted, more fully integrated with the knowledge systems of the communities whose ancestors are being studied. Consider for a moment the specific epistemological situation of trying to understand a population that existed 10,000 years ago in what is now northern British Columbia. You have, perhaps, a handful of skeletal remains, some of them well enough preserved to yield ancient DNA, others too degraded to be genetically informative. You have a collection of stone tools, projectile points, scrapers, bifaces that can be described and classified according to the typological schemes developed by generations of archaeologists, and that can be compared to tools from other sites to establish patterns of technological similarity and difference. You have the remains of the animals that were hunted and eaten, from which you can infer something about the subsistence strategies of the population. You have the radiocarbon dates from organic material in the site, which tell you when the site was occupied. And that is essentially it. From these fragments, you are trying to reconstruct the daily life of real people. people who woke up every morning in a landscape that was cold and sometimes dangerous and sometimes beautiful, who had relationships and obligations and memories and plans, who were embedded in social networks of kin and community that extended across the landscape, who had knowledge of the plants and animals and weather patterns of their territory that was deep and detailed and hard-won over generations, who had ways of understanding the world and their place in it that were sophisticated and internally consistent, even if they were completely different from the frameworks that a 21st century researcher brings to the analysis of their remains. The gap between what the evidence allows and what the reality was is immense. It is so large that any honest researcher has to hold their conclusions loosely, acknowledging that they are working with a tiny fraction of the information that would be needed to give a full account of the people they are studying. This is not a counsel of despair. The fragments are real, and the conclusions drawn from them, when drawn carefully, are real, but it is a reminder that the story being told from the evidence is inevitably partial, and that the partiality is not a minor methodological footnote, but a fundamental characteristic of the enterprise. What the ancient DNA of Canada tells us at this stage of the investigation is that the human history of the continent is older and more complex than the models that prevailed in the middle of the 20th century allowed. It tells us that there were people living along the coast of British Columbia during the last ice age, that there were distinct founding populations with different genetic signatures that arrived in North America through different routes at different times, that some of those populations survived and left descendants in modern communities, and some did not, and that the transition from an ice age world to a Holocene world was experienced differently by different groups depending on their geography and their subsistence strategies and the particular accidents of their encounters with other groups in a landscape that was itself transforming rapidly. What the ancient DNA of Canada does not yet tell us, but what future research may reveal, is the full picture of that diversity, the full count of distinct populations that existed in the territory of what is now Canada before the modern era, the full mapping of which of those populations left descendants and which did not, and why, the full account of the encounters and displacements and absorptions and extinctions that reduced the genetic diversity of ancient North America to the modern pattern, and the full understanding of the populations that left no trace in any modern genome, the ghost populations, the unmatched profiles, the people who were real and whose bones are in the earth and whose DNA is in the machines, and who nonetheless cannot be connected to anyone living today. These are questions that a generation of researchers will spend their careers trying to answer. They are hard questions. They require evidence that is difficult to find and difficult to interpret. They require collaboration across disciplines and across the boundary between academic research and Indigenous community knowledge. They require patience with ambiguity and comfort, with the possibility that some questions will not be answered in the lifetimes of the people asking them, but they are also, in the deepest sense, important questions. They are questions about who we are, about the full scope of human presence on this continent, about the full diversity of ways that human beings have found to live and to thrive and to understand the world, about the losses that have been sustained in the course of the long history of human settlement and migration and conflict and replacement. They are questions about what it means that some peoples survived and others did not, and about what the surviving peoples owe to the memory of those who disappeared, and about what the physical record of the deep past, the bones and the DNA and the tools and the sites, owes to the communities whose ancestors it represents. The cold water off the BC coast is very clear in certain places, in certain seasons, when the light comes at the right angle and there is no wind to disturb the surface. You can look down through it and see the sea floor, the rocks and the kelp and the occasional artifact of the present, a lost fishing weight or a crab pot tangled in the weed. And if you know where to look and what you're looking for, you can see the shapes of things that have been there much longer than any of the modern debris, the shapes of ground that was once dry, the shapes of what might be structure, might be habitation, might be the last visible remains of a place where someone lived and looked up at the same surface of the water from the other side, from the dry land side, from the side where the world was warm and accessible and full of everything a person could need. The ocean does not give up what it has taken easily, but the ice does slowly as it retreats, and what it reveals is often older than anyone expected. In the summer of 2008, a glaciologist working in the mountains of the Yukon documented something that had not been seen in living memory, and possibly not for thousands of years. The emergence from the retreating edge of a high-altitude glacier of organic material, plant matter, insect remains, animal bone, that had been frozen inside the ice since it was first entombed there during the last advance of the glacial mass. Accelerating melt across the mountain ranges of western Canada and Alaska is exposing these frozen archives at an unprecedented rate, and researchers have mobilized to sample them before the material, released from the preserving cold, degrades rapidly in the open air. What they are finding is extraordinary. Ancient patches of vegetation, mosses, sedges, lichens, preserved so perfectly that they can be identified to species, and in some cases brought back to life in the laboratory. Insects preserved in 3 dimensions, their chitin still intact, their structural colors sometimes still faintly visible, and in some cases, bone, human artifacts, the wooden shaft of a hunting dart preserved by the ice for more than 8,000 years, still bearing the tool marks of the person who shaped it. A robe or garment of twisted plant fiber, its weaving technique analyzable by textile researchers. Small objects whose function is uncertain, but whose craftsmanship suggests a level of skill and care that speaks to the intelligence of the people who made them. These ice patch sites, as they are called in the rapidly growing literature of a new sub-discipline of archaeology, are located primarily in the alpine zones of the Yukon and neighboring regions of British Columbia and Alaska, at elevations where the combination of cold and ice preserved what would otherwise have been lost. They were places where, for millennia, hunters drove caribou and other game onto the snow and ice patches that persisted through the summer, exploiting the animals' tendency to congregate on snow, to escape the insects of the warmer months. The accumulation of hunting debris at these sites, darts, spear points, the bones of hunted animals, created exactly the kind of stratified, datable record that archaeologists most want to find. And the biological material from these sites, the wood of the dart shafts, the fiber of the garments, occasionally the bone, is in a state of preservation that allows for ancient DNA extraction under the right conditions. Some of the animal bones from ice patch sites have yielded genetic data from caribou and other species that allows researchers to track population-level changes in animal genetics over thousands of years, a record of how the animals that people depended on for survival changed in response to the same climate and environmental pressures that shaped human population history. In a few cases, human biological material has been recovered from ice patch contexts, though the preservation and the ethical and legal frameworks for handling such material are both complex. The point is that the melting ice is revealing a Canada that was inhabited across enormous spans of time by people who moved through the alpine environments with skill and knowledge and purpose, who left their tools embedded in the ice when a hunt was particularly productive or when a dart was thrown and missed, who returned to the same high passes season after season because those passes were productive and because their knowledge of the landscape, encoded in oral tradition and transmitted across generations, told them to return. This continuity of use is one of the most striking features of the ice patch archaeological record. Sites that date to the early Holocene show artifact styles that are consistent with later styles from the same region, suggesting a cultural continuity across thousands of years that parallels the genetic continuity documented in the DNA record for some populations. The knowledge of the high passes, which ones led to good hunting, which ones offered shelter, which ones were dangerous in certain weather conditions, was preserved and transmitted across a span of time that dwarfs the entire recorded history of Western civilization. But the ice patch record also shows discontinuities. There are periods identifiable from the stratigraphy of the artifact accumulations when the sites were not used or were used differently. Gaps in the record that correspond to periods of climate change when the high altitude environments became less productive or less accessible, when the populations that had been using them contracted or moved or simply ceased. And then in some cases, a resumption, a new cultural presence at the same location, with different artifact styles, suggesting that the people who returned to a previously abandoned site were not the same people who had left it. These patterns of abandonment and reoccupation are the ice patch correlate of the genetic patterns visible in the ancient DNA record. Populations going away, populations coming in, the long-term record of a landscape that has been inhabited by multiple different groups over its history, each leaving its mark in the accumulated debris of daily life that the ice was kind enough to preserve. There is a technical term in population genetics, replacement, that is used to describe the situation where one population is substituted for another in a particular geographic region, with no or minimal genetic continuity between the two. Replacement, as a genetic event, is distinct from admixture, where two populations mix and both contribute to the resulting population. Replacement events are dramatic in the genetic record because they result in abrupt discontinuities. A population that was genetically X for thousands of years is suddenly genetically Y, with little or no trace of X remaining. This is what happened with the Dorset Thule transition in the Arctic. It is also what appears to have happened in multiple other places and at multiple other times in the deep human history of Canada. Understanding the causes of replacement events is challenging. The causes can range across a wide spectrum: violent conquest, competitive exclusion through resource depletion, epidemic disease, climate-driven collapse of a population's subsistence base, or simply the slow demographic dominance of a more numerous group. In many historical cases, multiple factors operate simultaneously, and distinguishing their relative contributions is difficult even with extensive written records. In the deep past, without written records, and with only the indirect evidence of genetics and archaeology, the reconstruction of causes is largely inferential. What is clear from both the genetic and the archaeological evidence is that the deep human history of Canada has included multiple replacement events, moments when the genetic and cultural composition of the population of a particular region changed rapidly and dramatically, when what was there before was supplanted by something new, and when the previous inhabitants either disappeared or were absorbed in proportions too small to leave a significant trace in the subsequent population. Each of these events represents, from the perspective of the replaced population, an ending. A world that ended not with the kind of dramatic, recorded catastrophe that fills history books, but quietly, incrementally, through the accumulation of losses that were not perceived as catastrophic at the time. Each bad hunting season, each group that failed to reproduce successfully, each territory that was ceded to more numerous neighbors, until the losses passed beyond recovery. The land that is now Canada has seen many such endings. Some of them are documented in the archaeological record, others are inferred from the genetic data, and some are probably still invisible to us. Populations that existed and disappeared before leaving any trace that current methods can detect. The endings that the ancient DNA revolution has made visible are only the most recent layer of a palimpsest that goes back to the first arrival of human beings in the Americas, whenever that was. The question of when that was, the absolute timing of the first human presence in what is now Canada, remains one of the most contested in the archaeology of the Americas. The conservative position, derived from the most securely dated archaeological sites, places the first unambiguous evidence for human presence in the interior of Canada at approximately 14,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the opening of the ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. The more aggressive position, supported by the Monte Verde dates and by several other sites in North and South America with claimed ages greater than 15,000 years, places the first human presence substantially earlier, before the ice-free corridor was open, which implies a coastal route. The coastal route hypothesis is supported by the oceanographic modeling of the kelp forest distribution during the late Pleistocene and by the discovery of sites like Triquet Island that demonstrate human occupation of the BC coast at 14,000 years ago, which is earlier than the opening of the interior corridor, but later than the most aggressive claims for the overall antiquity of human presence in the Americas. What the coastal sites show is that people were living on the coast when people in the interior were just beginning to arrive via the corridor, which means the coastal and interior populations were contemporaneous and probably distinct for at least some period. Whether the coastal people were genetically distinct from the interior people, whether the coastal migration and the interior migration brought different founding populations into what is now Canada, populations that then had to negotiate their relationship in the zones where the coast and the interior met, is a question that the current ancient DNA dataset for Canada cannot definitively answer. The sample sizes are too small, the geographic coverage too patchy, the temporal resolution too coarse, but it is a question that the growing dataset is beginning to address, and the preliminary signals are suggestive of a picture in which the coastal and interior populations of ancient Canada were not identical, that they had somewhat different ancestral compositions, and that the zones of contact between them were areas of both genetic exchange and cultural complexity. The Fraser River Corridor, the great river that drains the interior plateau of British Columbia and cuts through the coast mountains to reach the Pacific at what is now Vancouver, would have been one of the most important such zones of contact. The river was a highway in both directions, a route by which interior populations could access the coast, and a route by which coastal populations could penetrate the interior. The salmon runs that annually fill the river provided a resource rich enough to support dense populations, and the archaeological record of the Fraser drainage is one of the deepest and most complex in Canada, stretching back more than 10,000 years and showing multiple episodes of cultural change and population movement. The ancient DNA record from the Fraser Canyon region is sparse but suggestive. Individual ancient genomes from sites in the canyon show genetic profiles that are consistent with what is known about the founding populations of the Americas, but that also show signals of population structure, of genetic differentiation between groups occupying the same general region at different times, that imply a history of population replacement or significant admixture events in the canyon. This is consistent with the archaeological record, which also shows episodes of cultural replacement in the canyon, moments when the artifact assemblages change rapidly in ways that suggest new populations moving in. Whether those new populations were genetically distinct from the populations they replaced, and whether the replaced populations disappeared entirely or survived in diminished form and left fractional genetic contributions to subsequent groups, is exactly the kind of question that a larger ancient DNA dataset from the region could begin to answer. The work of assembling that dataset, of identifying appropriate sites, of obtaining the necessary permits and community consultations, of extracting and analyzing ancient DNA from samples that may be only marginally suitable for analysis, is ongoing. There is also the matter of the Haida-Gwaii archipelago, which deserves particular attention in any discussion of the deep human history of the B.C. coast. The islands of Haida, Gwaii, known until recently by the colonial name the Queen Charlotte Islands, are the traditional territory of the Haida Nation, whose cultural continuity in the archipelago stretches back at least 10,000 years, and by some measures considerably longer. The islands sit approximately 100 kilometers off the northern BC coast, separated from the mainland by the Hecate Strait, a body of water that during the last glacial maximum was substantially shallower, and in some places dry land, because the lower sea level would have exposed large areas of the current strait as a broad coastal plain. During the glacial maximum, Haida-Gwaii was not an island group, but a peninsula or series of peninsulas extending from a larger landmass. The animals and plants that were present on it during that period, documented from cave sites, including the now famous archaeological finds on the islands, were the fauna of a connected landscape, not an isolated archipelago, and the human beings who may have inhabited the area during the same period were living in a very different geographic context than the one that exists today. The Haida oral tradition of deep antiquity on these islands is consistent with what the archaeology is beginning to confirm, that the islands were inhabited very early by people whose relationship to the landscape was formed during a period when that landscape looked very different from what it looks like now. When the sea level rose and the strait widened and the islands became an archipelago, the people who were already there became islanders. Their world contracted geographically, even as their expertise in marine subsistence grew, their isolation increasing over time as the water between them and the mainland deepened. This isolation, if it occurred, and the geography strongly suggests that it did, would have had genetic consequences. An isolated island population, cut off from gene flow with mainland groups, would have diverged genetically from its mainland relatives over time. It would have accumulated unique combinations of alleles through genetic drift, and it would have developed cultural and technological adaptations to the specific conditions of island life that differed from the adaptations of mainland populations. When contact was eventually reestablished, as the development of better watercraft technology made crossing the strait feasible, the island population and the mainland population would have been different. Not so different as to be incompatible, but different enough to show up as distinct in a genetic analysis. The full investigation of this scenario, the genetic history of the Haida Gwaii population and its relationship to mainland populations over the course of the Holocene, requires ancient DNA from the archipelago across a time span of many thousands of years, analyzed in the context of the genetic diversity of mainland BC populations across the same span of time. That investigation is in its early stages. The results, when they come, will add significantly to the understanding of how island isolation shapes human genetic diversity and of how the specific geography of the BC coast shaped the population history of the region during the period following the glacial maximum. All of this work, the ice patch archaeology, the underwater surveys, the ancient DNA analysis of skeletal remains from cave sites, and river valley excavations and island middens, is cumulative. Each piece of evidence adds to a picture that is becoming more detailed and more complex with every year. The picture that is emerging is not the one that textbook prehistory presented to generations of students, not a simple story of migration across a land bridge, not a clean timeline of cultural succession, not a landscape that was empty before the arrival of its first inhabitants and then uniformly populated by a single founding people who spread across it without significant internal differentiation. The picture is messier than that, more interesting, more human. It is a picture of real people, genetically diverse, culturally varied, organized in groups that range from small bands to larger networks, adapting to an enormous range of environments across an enormous geographic area, sometimes meeting each other in ways that ended in admixture, and sometimes in ways that ended in replacement, sometimes holding on to genetic distinctiveness across thousands of years, and sometimes mixing thoroughly with their neighbors, sometimes surviving the disruptions of climate change and competition, and sometimes not. The ones who did not survive, the ghost populations, the unmatched DNA profiles, the people whose bones are in the earth and whose genes are in the machines but who are connected to nobody living, are the most haunting part of this picture. They are the reminder that survival is not the default condition of human populations, that the world we inhabit and the diversity we take as normal are the results of a selective process that retained some lineages and discarded others, and that the retained lineages, however rich and varied, represent only a fraction of the full diversity that existed in the deep past. To know that is not simply to feel sad about what was lost, though sadness is an appropriate response to the scale of the loss. It is also to recognize something important about the present, that the diversity that does survive in the living Indigenous communities of Canada and in the genetic record of those communities is precious and irreplaceable in exactly the same way that the diversity of the deep past was precious and irreplaceable. That the processes that reduced ancient genetic diversity, climate change, competition, disease, displacement, are processes that are still operating in different forms and at different scales in the contemporary world, and that the study of the deep past, precisely because it allows us to see those processes playing out across time scales long enough to observe their full consequences, is not a purely academic exercise, but a contribution to the understanding of something that matters urgently in the present. The people who match no known population on Earth are not merely a curiosity or a mystery. They are a mirror, a reflection from the deep past of the fragility and the finitude of human diversity. They are evidence that what exists can end, that genetic lineages can be lost, that the full range of human difference that once existed in this world was greater than what we now have, and that what we now have is the product not of inevitability, but of contingency, of the particular accidents of history that allowed some groups to survive and forced others to extinction. The bones are in the earth, the DNA is in the machines. The work continues season by season, sample by sample, genome by genome, in laboratories and in the field, in the mountains and along the coast and in the Arctic, and in the great river valleys that drain the heart of the continent. The people who did this work, and who continue to do it, are asking the same question in 100 different forms. Who was here? Who were they? What happened to them? And why, when the analysis is done and the data is processed and the comparison is run against every known reference population in the world, does the answer sometimes come back as nothing? No match, no known descendants, no surviving trace in any living person on Earth. The question has no single answer. It has many partial answers, assembled slowly from the evidence that can be recovered, contextualized by the knowledge of living communities, and held with the appropriate intellectual humility of people who know that they are working at the edge of what can be known. The edge moves as the tools improve and the data sets grow and the collaborative relationships between researchers and indigenous communities deepen. It moves toward a more complete picture, not a complete one, because the complete picture of the deep human past of Canada is not recoverable, not entirely, not by any means currently available or foreseeable. But the partial picture that is emerging is extraordinary. It is a picture of human beings in all their variety and resilience and vulnerability, living in a land that tested them across thousands of years, and that they nevertheless came to know with an intimacy that shaped them as profoundly as it shaped the land itself. It is a picture that reaches back past the names and the borders and the categories that structure modern life into a time when the land was already old and already full, when the mountains had already been named in languages that are now forgotten, when the rivers had already been fished by hands that left their genetic traces in frozen soil and cave sediment, for researchers who would not be born for another 10,000 years to eventually, carefully, reverently extract and sequence and try to understand. They were here, they were real. And the fact that we are only now beginning to understand how real they were and how many of them there were and how long they were here before the world as we know it began is itself a kind of tribute to the depth of the human story on this continent, a story that has barely begun to be told in its full complexity, and that will keep generating surprises and reversals and moments of genuine wonder for as long as there are people patient and curious enough to dig for it. And the DNA does, carefully, when the conditions are right and the technology is ready and the people doing the asking are willing to accept an answer that does not fit any of the categories they brought with them to the laboratory. They found ancient remains in Canada. The DNA matched no known population on Earth. And the world they belong to, the wide world before the water rose and the ice melted and everything changed, is still there in fragments waiting to be read.